In this piece, I'm going to quickly review supply and demand and apply it to the labor market. I really think with what we've already discussed around supply and demand, we have the tools to address the kind of things that we're looking at. We just need to make sure that we are able to translate a couple of terms from the labor market to our traditional supply and demand framework for any typical good or service or back. So that's what I'm out to do in this video segment. So as quickly as I can, I'm going to run through what we've discussed in the past with supply and demand. Quantities on the horizontal axis, price on the vertical axis. Demand is downward sloping because the law of demand says that at greater prices we're willing and able to buy less. And all else held constant. And the other things that sometimes aren't constant are what we call the determinants of demand. These things are the things that shift it. And there are 5. There's our income. If we make more money for a normal good, we'll buy more of it. So that's our increase in demand. There's our taste. If we lose our taste for something as a large group or as an individual, we'll buy less of it, all else held constant. The third thing is an important one in terms of this chapter, and that's the price of related goods. And I've always said price was a bit of a strong term. It could be the cost to consumers of related goods. And there are 2 kinds of related goods. There are complements, things that go together, and there are substitutes, things that can be used in place of each other, substitutes. And then there's also expectations, which affects demand. If you expect the price of something to be higher in the future, that might increase demand now. And then there's also the mechanical relationship. It's the number of buyers. More people means more demand, all else held constant. So those were our determinants of demand. And then let's shift back to supply. Supply is upward sloping because at low prices, sellers aren't willing and able to sell very much relative to at high prices where sellers are willing and able to sell more. Now on that note, I want to point something out about the labor market. The demand for labor is not done by households. Demand for labor is done by firms, businesses, also public sector firms, government, whatever. But the hirers do the demanding for labor. It's not households. And sometimes when students struggle with the labor market, they're so used to thinking of demand being households and supply being businesses that that's what causes the struggle. So knock that out of your thinking right now. Firms are who do the demanding in the labor market. Where households do the selling or the supply in the labor market. But I'm still reviewing supply and demand. Just know that the roles are twisted when we're talking about the labor market. So there are 4 determinants of supply, and they're true for the labor market as well. That's what I'm getting at. The first one is input prices. And you might be thinking, as a laborer, as a household, how do I have input prices to my supply of labor? Well, that's real easy. That's your opportunity cost. Do you have anything better to do? That's your input price to your labor. That's why I think the used compact discs are a fairly decent example, even though compact discs are largely obsolete. We could all take the time and effort to sell our used stuff. It's that time and effort, our opportunity cost, that is a big part of whether or not we do that. It's just like an input price for a manufacturer or something. Their input prices might be along the lines of raw materials. Our input prices are the other things we could be doing. The second of these is technology, and that's the knowledge of how to do something. The third is expectations. And then the fourth is that mechanical relationship. It's the number of sellers. And one thing I want to point out, I'll use this input prices as an example. If input prices rise, all else held constant, what does that mean about supply? Are sellers as willing and able to sell the good as they were before? No. If input prices rise, they're less willing and able to sell the good, all else held constant. So it would decrease supply. And remember this, a decrease in supply looks like this. And what that does is pushes up on the equilibrium wage. That is where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. And because of that higher price, the consumer's quantity demanded falls along the demand curve. So I wanted to review that because that is a decrease in supply. I deliberately made it look like an increase. That's a Jedi mind trick. Don't fall for that. The supply curve has moved this way. When input prices rise, it costs more to make something. Sellers are willing and able to sell less. That pushes up on the price, which means fewer units will be bought. All else held constant. So that's a lightning fast review of the supply and demand framework. Now let me step toward the labor market just a little bit. What's the price of labor? Does labor cost money? Yes. The price of labor has a specific name, so we just use that to label the vertical axis. That's the wage. We'll abbreviate that with the W. The quantity of labor may be the number of people employed or the number of hours they are employed for, and we usually just use a capital L to abbreviate labor, and we just need to specify some times which one we're talking about. For most of our purposes, we're talking about the number of workers, but it could be worker hours. So this is our market for labor. Who does the selling of labor? Well, let me ask you this. Relatively speaking, if you're paid a little, how motivated are you to work? Now, what if you're paid a lot? How motivated are you to work? Probably more. Pay me a little, I'm only willing and able to work a little. Pay me a lot, all else held constant, I'm willing and able to work more. We are the sellers of labor. And all that could be increased if I have nothing better to do. That would be like having lower input prices. You know, if colleges completely close due to coronavirus, that would be probably result in a pretty significant jump in labor supply. Now, there might not be jobs available for people to fill, but the opportunity cost would go down. It would be like having lower input prices. So that would increase the supply of labor. Remember, we are the sellers of labor. Who buys labor? It's on an hourly basis. Firms do. Oops. So they are the demanders for labor. At very high wage rates, firms won't hire as many people as at low wage rates. All else held constant. And at this particular wage, the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. So that's how many workers get hired. Now let's suppose something happens like an automated process comes along. Like let's say we're focusing on low wage laborers. That's where I like to focus. I think that's where we have the most interesting kinds of policy conversations. Let's say we're talking about low wage workers, and a new development comes along in technology where through our phones, UPC codes for any store can easily be scanned, and you can check out through your phone walking through the store. You follow my scenario? Like everybody who has a smartphone, you're walking through 7-Eleven, you pick it up, you go boop, and you own it. Boop, you own it. There's no need to have a checkout person anymore, is there? I mean, there might be a few people who don't have smartphones. Are you following? What's the relationship between this piece of capital, the smartphone app, and labor? Aren't they substitutes? Can't some jobs be done by machines? They're substitutes. If the substitute gets cheaper, what does that do to demand for this good? Decreases it. Let me rephrase that with the example I was going down the road of. If the smartphone app becomes readily available and everybody can use it, it's a substitute for labor. That decreases the demand for labor. Notice there's no fixed number of jobs. You can't really say, oh, those jobs are gone. Well, there'll be fewer people employed, but that's because it doesn't pay as well. That's a decrease in the quantity supply of labor because of what it does to wages. There is no fixed number of jobs in an economy. There's no fixed number of jobs in an economy. When variable changes happen, the effect is on wages, and people come out to work at higher wages. That would be increases in quantity supplied, or people leave because of depressed wages, and that's a decrease in quantity supplied. So that's one example that's pretty closely related to some of the homework questions, I think. So I'm going to stop here and see if I can come up with another couple of examples and maybe make a separate segment of just examples of what I'm talking about.